How do you define freedom? The prevailing understanding is the ability to do whatever somebody wants without limits, so long as you don't hurt somebody else. But is that true freedom? What does it mean in particular for a Christian to be free? And what does freedom rightly understood look like in society? Hi, I'm Richard Nelson with the Commonwealth Matters. And joining us to talk further is Brad Littlejohn, former fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and author of the new book, Called to Freedom, Retrieving Christian Liberty in an Age of License. Brad, welcome to the Commonwealth Matters.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hey, let's start from a Christian perspective in the idea of spiritual freedom. You say in your book that in a spiritual sense, we are either slaves to self or slaves to Christ. Now, when I hear the word slavery, I think the opposite of freedom, but this isn't the case, is it?
No, the reality is that all of us are going to be following our desires, and the question is, what are our highest desires? Or rather, are we following our lowest desires, or are we following our highest desires? And what Paul teaches us is that if we're not slaves to Christ, then we're going to be slaves to our belly, slaves to our sinful desires, slaves to whatever impulse first presents itself. And I think that's very much the condition in which so many modern Americans find themselves. We have this idea that, as you said, freedom just means doing whatever you want. And what we want is just whatever appetites are kind of right in front of our eyes. And what the New Testament teaches us, and I think what our own experience teaches us, if we're honest enough, is that that's not really an experience of freedom. To just be pulled to and fro by warring desires is not an experience of meaningful freedom. I define freedom as the capacity for meaningful action. And there's a lot in that definition. We can unpack it. But, one of the things is just that the idea of action, human action, is goal-oriented. It means pursuing an end. And that means being able to say no to distractions, things that might pull you away from that end that you really want to pursue. And so it's really only in subordinating our desires to Christ that we're able to be liberated from that power of sin that pulls us away from the end that is in which we find our true freedom.
Yeah, that's good. You say in your book that spiritual freedom is freedom from sin, not freedom to sin. And just picking up on what you're talking about, those appetites that are before us. Now, the human condition is that we need food. We need to eat. But I think what you're saying is that when we are absolutely controlled by this desire, and if I could add, when we live in a culture that's constantly feeding this idea and pushing this idea, just let your belly be your guide, right? And we advertise this constantly, like this meal or that experience, this will fill you. And I think what you're talking about is to be controlled by those appetites and by those lower desires, controlled in a way where that dominates us. Is that correct? Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah. I mean, the way that the way that Plato talks about this in his Republic is the kind of rightly ordered soul that has the reason, and then the kind of higher emotions, the sense of honor and shame, and then below that the appetites, and they all have a role to play. To be embodied means to have appetites, and those appetites serve an important function, but they have to be kept in subjection. They have to be governed in their proper place. And the way that St. Augustine, kind of channeling Plato in the Christian tradition, talks about this is the idea of rightly ordered loves. Everything that God made is good in as much as it exists, and this therefore should be loved in its proper place. But the question is that in its proper place is where we tend to go astray, and we love the least things the most, and we love the most important things the least. And when that happens, we don't actually have control of ourselves, and thus we're not masters of our own actions. And And so we are, as Paul says, slaves to sin.
Yeah, that's good. That's well said. So you talk about this idea of choice. The idea of choice in our society is held up as some kind of a sacred right, right? You hear politicians talking about different areas of choice. But you say in your book that choice is not an intrinsic good. And yet it's held up as a fundamental all-American value that we should all be for. Just some context here, Brad. The right to life issue has been a big issue in Kentucky, as it has across the nation. And just the other day, a young woman here in Kentucky who advocated for abortion rights here in the Commonwealth won USA Today's Woman of the Year award because she's advocated for reproductive freedom. In other words, the freedom for women to choose an abortion, freedom of choice. So choice is not an intrinsic good, as you say in your book. Unpack that a little bit. Explain more, if you would.
Well, I think the question is, do our choices ultimately lead us to greater flourishing or on a path of bondage and self-destruction, right? So we can see this clearly in the phenomenon of addiction, where somebody chooses something initially freely, but the nature of the choice they make is one that reduces their freedom, and so then they, next time they're confronted with that choice, it's harder to actually make a rational choice, and they feel more compelled to choose the thing, and it goes on and on until they really have no choice in the matter. They just keep on doing the addictive, self-destructive behavior. So it matters what we choose. Some of our choices are lead on this upward path, and some of them lead on a downward path that is actually attacking our own humanity. And of course, the choice to destroy another life is one of the most dehumanizing choices that you can make. So what we choose matters. But the other thing to note is, I mean, I think, what we want to say is, from one standpoint, you could say only the choice for virtue is the good choice, and therefore should we as a society only allow one choice, one path, the path of virtue? And as Americans, we're naturally and rightly wary of the idea of some authority trying to constrain and advance and tell you you're only allowed to choose the right thing because, well, we might disagree over what the right thing is. And so there has to be some, and we're supposed to grow into the maturity of being able to exercise our own judgment and decision making. And so there is a proper scope of choice that we're supposed to have as mature adults, where we can look at different possible goods and try to choose the right one. And sometimes we'll get it wrong, but better at least to have the freedom to get it wrong than not to have freedom at all. So that's an intuition we have as Americans, and that's not a wrong intuition. That there has to be some range of choices before us, not just the one right choice, that even if we think that we know what that is. But what I think where our intuition has really gone off the rails is the idea that, since the movement from zero choices to one choice is obvious, or rather, I guess one choice is the same as zero choices. So the movement from one choice to two choices is an increase in freedom. And then if I have 5 options to choose between, well, then that also increases my freedom. And it means I'm also more likely to be able to optimize, to choose the option that is best for me, because we're all a little bit different. If there's 10 options, then maybe that's even better. But is that true if we go from 10 to 100 or 100 to 1,000? Probably not. The reality is that at some point, when you continue to multiply options, you don't improve and empower choice. You actually undermine it because you become overwhelmed with the sheer number of options. And you cease to be able to actually exercise your own freedom. What tends to happen in these situations, which is what we find ourselves in every day as modern Americans, just confronted with overwhelming numbers of consumer choices. Whenever we get on the internet, we're confronted with the almost infinity of choices that the digital domain offers us. And what tends to happen is we follow the path of least resistance. We follow where the algorithm leads us. We follow where the crowd leads. We actually give up our freedom because we don't know how to exercise our freedom with that many choices.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's well said. We do face the headwinds of a culture and a mindset that wants to offer more choices. Those choices that are at our fingertips because of modern technology. I think of Reels and TikTok and social media. We're bombarded with all these choices, and oftentimes, if we're honest with ourselves, if we find ourselves on social media, we'll end up scrolling, right? Death scrolling and looking at these reels. And at a certain moment, it sets in like, what am I doing? Right? I just wasted a perfectly good hour looking at these reels that have captured my attention. But is it helping me? Is this shaping me? Is this a good use of my time? We don't ask those questions like we should, do we?
No, absolutely. I think that's a great example of how, uh, you know, all freedom means service of something. And if you're not serving God and pursuing virtue, then that exercise of your freedom is going to turn into a kind of bondage to whoever is best at capturing your attention and manipulating your desires.
Yeah. I find personally, and I've tried to wean myself off of social media use. Organizationally, we have a presence there because we need to. That's where people are. But personally, I find that it's mind numbing. Maybe it's some kind of it's where I can check out and I'll end up scrolling or looking at reels. And I just realized I'd be better off either taking a walk outside or reading a book or spending time with my wife in conversation. And there's a discipline there. I've got to force myself and remind myself of what is the best choice and what is shaping me, and how to best use my time. Brad, I want to move on to another thing you say in your book, that freedom and liberty are now used as stand-ins for licentiousness. And we've seen that today. And I think maybe the best example is this idea of expressive individualism, so prevalent, where you are your own person, be whatever you want to be, no limits, no boundaries to that. And I think the best example is with this idea that gender is malleable and that you can transcend your biological born gender. And now it's been recognized in across the country in many states that the transgender person has rights, even at the expense of women's private spaces. And all of this is done in the name of freedom. Now, of course, we've seen pushback against this, but for a few years now, we have seen this idea that something that wasn't a right is now a right, even pushing against biological reality and then pushing against other rights as well. How do you respond? I guess here's the question in this. How would you respond to critics who say that Christians are imposing their convictions on non-believers when it comes to gender, right? And when it comes to female-only spaces, what would be your response?
Yeah, I think that ultimately human freedom must be the freedom to act in accord with human nature, and that's true of any uh, any being that we can think of. It is it has a determinate nature. It has certain limits, certain things that it has biological structures. It has certain things that it's good at and certain things that it's not good at. And a squirrel is only going to succeed in as much as it behaves in a way that's in accord with squirrel nature, right? It needs to store up nuts for the winter. If it doesn't do that, it's going to die. It might be good at jumping from limb to limb, but if it tries to fly, that's not going to turn out very well. And so for us as human beings, similarly, our nature is much more open-ended than that of other animals, and that's part of what it means to be created in the image of God and to have dominion over the creatures. Is human nature is capable of many different forms of flourishing and perfection, right? I mean, you've got from Einstein to an Olympic long jumper, very very different forms of human excellence. And that can tempt us into thinking that our nature is just totally malleable and open ended. And I think this is particularly what's happened with us over the past century and a half, particularly is with medical technology. We've faced very um, kind of harsh limits to our physical capabilities for much of human history because of our lack of medical knowledge. And many children died in infancy. Many, if you lived past infancy, you probably didn't make it past middle age. And diseases that we now just think are, you know, easy to deal with were death sentences. And so we lived under these crippling limits of our natural environment, and modern technology enabled us to overcome those one after another and kind of push back the boundaries within of necessity within which human beings had been forced to operate for centuries. And for a long time, this was experienced as an expansion of freedom. I mean, it's obviously an expansion of a woman's freedom to not have to be you know facing like a 25% chance of death in childbirth every time uh, she conceives. But what happens is, again, where I said like earlier, with we think, if a move from 2 options to 10 options increases freedom, then the move from 10 options to 100 options, but not necessarily. There's a point of diminishing returns. And so there's a point at which our technology, our biotechnology, uh, is helping us to become more fully human by overcoming some of these uh, impediments that are the result of the fall. But then we think, okay, that was great. What's the next step? And we start pushing up against those limits of we've dealt with all the limitations that are due to disease. What about the limits that are just a built-in feature of our bodily nature? Well, we're like, those are constraining too. If I'm a woman and I want to be a man, why can't I? Why is there this limit standing in my way? And so we think that we need to use technology to take that extra step and continue to increase our freedom by abolishing the limitations that are intrinsic in human nature. But again, at some point, that process reaches a point of not just diminishing returns, but negative returns. And C.S. Lewis talks about this in his Abolition of Man. When we turn our technologies against our human nature in the name of increasing our freedom, that's not the abolition of slavery. That's the abolition of man.
There's a proverb that says, when a land transgresses, it has many rulers, but with a man of understanding and knowledge, its stability will long continue. The idea here is that when people live without regard to their neighbors and without moral boundaries, then you need more government to restrain people who've gone off the rails. So if people are going to flourish, God's truth must be embraced. After all, God tells us who we are, what's our purpose, and how to live in harmony with our fellow man. Christians should understand what God's Word says and how to think biblically about the issues so that they can engage well. To stay up to date with what's going on in Kentucky, subscribe to CPC's newsletter. Go to CommonwealthPolicyCenter.org to subscribe, and you can also find other resources there. Thank you, and may God bless you. Brad, if I could bring in a recent example of what I think you're talking about is in vitro fertilization. It's an amazing technology that allows for couples to have children apart from the natural conjugal process by which children come into the world, how they're created. Some would hear what you're saying and say that you're against that. And I guess that's a huge can of worms I just opened right there. But let me go a little further. So, for example, let's say it's an unmarried couple. Let's say it's a single person that wants to bring a child into the world with a sperm donor or an egg donor, and they want to be a single parent. This, I think, is what you're pushing against, at least in that context, very clearly. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, yeah. So I think, I'm concerned about the practice across the board. I think there are certainly conditions under which it's far more problematic. I think, you know, I mean, there's particular issues in terms of the destruction of embryos that goes into the process. As I understand, you can try to do the procedure in a way where you say we're not going to let any embryos be destroyed. You can do it within a marriage where it's the husband's sperm and the wife's egg, and yet, and what happens when we kind of normalize that practice and just think, oh, this is just something that we can do, is that we come to think of we come to think of humanity itself as something that is made as a product of human technique rather than begotten by these mysterious power in nature that is really that we is a kind of a miracle. We don't understand how it happens. It's this miracle of fertility and natality that God has made us for. Instead, we come to think this is something that we control. This is something that we engineer, and therefore, why shouldn't we just keep on? Why shouldn't if we can engineer it happening? Why don't we optimize it? And this is where you get like, why don't we make sure that it's the best possible genetic material? And it's a very dark road that starts along. And so I think I think for any individual couple, Christian couple, facing this this challenge of fertility, I don't want to just you know slap them down and say you're participating in some grievous evil, but I do think people need to step back and think about the gravity of it, and particularly. I think one of the problems is I just wrote an article with a couple of co-authors called "Stop Hacking Humans," talking about how so much of our modern technology has this kind of hackers mentality, where the hacker of a computer system says, "Okay, here's the way the system is built and programmed, but I'm clever enough to kind of find a shortcut through the code that gets me the output that I want without going through the normal processes." And often you can do that once or twice or three times, but the system gets destabilized every time you hack. And I think we have a similar approach to human nature now, where we think of ourselves as just malleable programs that we can find a shortcut to getting the output that we want. And the result is usually actually damage to our own health, damage to our society's health. And often the slower, longer way around is still available, but we don't even try it because it's just easier to use the hack. And so, for instance, very often now doctors will just go straight to couples that are struggling to conceive. They'll just go straight to say, let's do IVF, when there may be pathways of restorative reproductive medicine that are available that are just not even tried because why would you bother if we got this quick fix?
That's good. And I would just add to that too, that we are on this path once we've opened Pandora's box to creating human life, which I think maybe there were good intentions there, but Pandora's box is open, and we're talking about gene editing and perfecting the child, and it's a path and really questions we'll be addressing in the near future. Right, I want to move on to something you said in your book about traditional societies. You said that they are more concerned with how people use their freedom than the simple possession of such freedom. And I'm curious if you found a watershed moment in American history when we lost this idea of how freedom should be used rightly, and that we should be concerned with how freedom is used instead of simply possessing freedom. Was there a watershed at some point?
I don't know that there's one watershed. No, I think that, I mean, to some extent, I think you have different views of freedom baked in from the beginning. There's a really interesting book published a few decades ago called Albion's Seed that traces the different migrations to the colonies from different parts of England that represented different subcultures. And he goes through, I think, like 15 different aspects of each of these subcultures, and one of them is their different views of freedom. So he says there are different ideas of freedom present in early America, and one of them is the one that we kind of it tends to settle in Appalachia, and it's the idea of if you can see the smoke from your neighbor's chimney, it's getting too crowded and you better uproot and go somewhere else. The kind of idea of freedom as me and my house and my gun and my dogs, and I don't want anyone to interfere. And that is one idea of freedom that is part of some of the early American settlers. But the founding fathers, who mostly crafted our Constitution, largely had a different understanding of freedom that was exercised in community. And this is one of the important things I talk about in my book, is this understanding that freedom has both an individual and a corporate dimension. That because we are made for one another, there are things that I'm only free to do in as much as I do them along with other people. And the example I give is congregational singing, right? If Christian liberty meant that the worship leader can't tell me what song to sing, I should just sing whatever, whatever praise hymn or praise song most expresses my own feelings of devotion at that moment. Well, then nobody is actually going to be free to sing, right? You're going to have a couple hundred people belting out a couple hundred different tunes. So there's a restraint of liberty that's necessary to experience a greater liberty, where we say, this is the song that we're all going to sing next. Might not be my favorite song, but better for us all to enjoy singing not our favorite song together than for us to sing 200 different things, right? And so this idea of freedom as a kind of harmonization, I use that musical metaphor, harmonizing individual wills within a greater corporate will. That's kind of the vision of freedom that you had in the Mid-Atlantic and New England colonies in particular, according to Albion Seed, and that was particularly represented among the founding fathers. But as one of the things that you have about America that's different from Europe is just almost limitless supply of available land westward. And so there's a constant, what this means is, if you're having trouble getting along with your neighbors, if you don't like the decisions that your town council has made or whatever, then you can always uproot and move west. And that encourages this kind of frontier mentality of, don't mess with me, that becomes increasingly baked into the American psyche over, I think, the 19th century. And that we are not forced to learn how to live with one another. And this is, of course, part of our religious experience too. I mean, tremendous, like the proliferation of different denominations, right? The church is being like, I disagree over this one little thing. I'm going to go start another denomination, and we're going to move over to Missouri, or we're going to move over to Kansas, or whatever. The Mormon Church is actually a good example of that. This is part of our history as Americans. And I don't think there's one watershed moment, but I think it's something that we have to grapple with, and something where we have to actually work to get back to that more healthy founding consensus.
Very good. Brad Littlejohn, thank you so much for joining us on the Commonwealth Matters.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.